Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for that kind introduction. Just firstly, to congratulate the German Chancellor, Ms. Angela Merkel, for her winning the Person of the Year award yesterday. Secondly, to congratulate the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for once again taking the conversation on using cultural diplomacy to achieve peace and reconciliation. I like the theme of our conversation, which is really looking at building bridges of peace and reconciliation in times of greater global insecurity. I'm certain you all agree with me that except for the 2 world wars, we've never had so much turbulence in our world. In fact, if somebody was traveling into our planet from a different planet, they would be excused for thinking that we are having our 3rd World War. I'm even wondering if they would be wrong in thinking that we are indeed in the middle of the 3rd World War. I thank the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for involving me and, by extension, my office, the Public Protector South Africa, and my country, South Africa, in this very timely conversation. Yes, my speech is on peace, social justice, and the rule of law. Are we missing the link? I thought I would just go straight to the point in terms of what are the key points I want to make, then try and justify them afterwards. To achieve peace, we need to reimagine the rules of coexistence domestically and globally. We need to reimagine and rethink domestic and national governance. We need to rethink democracy by principally mainstreaming social justice, good governance, and the rule of law in our day-to-day democratic practices. Many of the rules and practices that inform our understanding of democracy and global governance were developed on the basis of certain assumptions that existed many years ago. Times and reality have turned out differently. This morning we heard that a lot of the arrangements we have in the United Nations, where we come together as nations, were developed around 1945. It was a different world then. The initial countries that were involved in the conversation were 5, and when the first declaration was signed, there were 29 countries. And I noticed when I was working on my paper that in Africa, the only country that participated in those initial discussions was South Africa. And even then, it was not the South Africa we know. It was what we referred to as white South Africa, because that was the South Africa that excluded the voices of the black majority then. But flip to 2015, we still have those same arrangements, and we think they can still cater for the world that has changed. And it hasn't changed only in terms of the number of countries that form the United Nations. It has also changed one thing fundamentally. In 1945, we're still asking the question, how do we live together in peace and harmony? And at a time when there were walls and when there was distance, we meeting in 2015 where there are no walls. Even if we wanted to build them, it would be useless because from an environmental point of view, the clouds have no borders. From a communications point of view, we are in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution, which is the information revolution. Whether we like it or not, therefore, we are living together. We're in a virtual one big country with compartments within it. And therefore, those rules were formulated at a time when you thought that when you erected a big physical border, and if you even made it a wall like China, and as the case was here in Germany between East and West, you could keep the other side on the other side and you could protect yourself. These days, you can create as thick a wall as you want. There are just things like the internet, like information technology in all its forms that bring us together, but obviously globalization in its general sense, including global warming, is bringing us all together. So I hope you'll agree with me, colleagues, then, that more of the same can't be the answer to today's challenges. And what is one of those challenges? If we're saying there's a huge war around us, what is one of the challenges is Her Excellency mentioned is global terrorism. Can we fight global terrorism using more of the same? One of the speakers this morning said no. And I arrived at the same conclusion as I was preparing for this paper, which is really an adapted version of a paper I've presented in several forums, that we really can't continue to do the same. What we have employed in fighting global terrorism, for example, and what the terrorists themselves have employed in fighting for whatever cause it is they are fighting for, have not yielded sustainable outcomes. I believe that those who are fighting on the other side of terror, of unleashing terror, and those who are fighting against terror are never going to achieve sustainable solutions unless one group totally annihilates the other. And I also believe that you can't totally annihilate the other group without totally annihilating the earth. So if you continue in the trajectory we are moving in, we might just find that eventually we annihilate all of us. Very few people, particularly in this room, will disagree with the assertion that the average person, regardless of culture, religion, place, or class, yearns for a stable, loving, and peaceful world. Yet, despite that, we are engaged in war. The way we're engaged, though, it's a question of one group winning battles and the next one winning the next battle, but no group can claim to be winning the war. Is the war winnable for peace, or for whatever it is those who are unleashing terror are fighting for? I'm interested in your views. Recently, I watched a movie by the name, it had the title American Sniper. And one of the Marines in the movie comments that, he's a senior, comments that the war on terror isn't a winnable one, but stopping the counterattacks is not an option if you want to survive. So we're caught in that situation where to continue to survive, we have to fight, but we know we're not going to win. That's what these young people who are involved in the front line of it are saying. But what would be interesting would be to find out if the people on the other side think that theirs is winnable, that they would get the point where the world would surrender and say, fine, take over. We're all aware that in Palestine, where the Israelis and Palestinians have been involved in a war for many, many years, neither side at this stage believes military victory is probable or even possible. What is possible, though, is that after each defeat, each side regroups and finds better weapons and unleashes more devastating strikes, and the cycle goes on endlessly. The continent where I come from, Africa, is also involved in the conflict. Apart from terrorism, there is domestic conflict in some of the countries. War is not merely, rather, peace is not merely the absence of war. So even in those countries where there's nobody who's carrying a literal gun, there is no peace in most of our countries today. If people are not expressing themselves through outrightly going to the streets, there's just rumors of conflict that is yet to express itself. The incidence of attacks, particularly on civilians, is increasing globally. And not only is the incidence increasing numerically, the viciousness is also increasing. From our side, those who claim to be on the other side of terror, our responses are counterstrikes, including drones that are killing many civilians, leaving some maimed, homeless, and destitute. And of course, we have a refugee crisis caused by the domestic wars and terrorism and counterterrorism. Young people are forced by these groups that are fighting on the side of terror to be on the side of terrorism. And this includes children as young as under 10, many of which are used as human sacrifices. The media calls them human bombs. We believe they're not. They call them, suicide bombers. We believe they're not suicide bombers. They're human bombs or human sacrifices. Because a child under age is incapable of appreciating what they're doing or stopping what they have to do. But also we know that some of them have been abducted. You still remember the Chibok girls from Nigeria. When they left, there were 200. A few of them have trickled back, but many are still missing. How do we know that some of them are now not being used as so-called suicide bombers when they're just human sacrifices? And we do know some of them may have been sold as sex slaves, as wives, and in things like that. But one thing for sure that brings me to why I'm speaking about social justice and the rule of law is something common, whether you're fighting on the side of terror or against terror, is what? Is the fact that the rules that used to regulate war have flown out of the window. And it doesn't matter which side of the war you are on, these rules seem not to apply. And I just thought I would remind you of some of those. These rules that sought to limit the impact of war and cruelty on civilians mostly come from international humanitarian law, developed mostly around 1945 to 1949 but amended right up to the 70s. I think the last amendments being done around 1977. Geneva Conventions, Hague Conventions. And key amongst those rules are the following. Persons outside of conflict and those not taking part in conflict situation shall be protected in all circumstances. That's neither done by the terrorists, nor done by those who are fighting against terrorism. Secondly, the wounded and the sick are to be protected in conflict situations. In this particular case, everyone protects their own. Captured persons must be protected against acts of violence and reprisals. We do know that both sides, when they've captured combatants from the other side, there is torture, there is often killing, and sometimes in broad daylight to make a lesson. No one shall be subject to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or derogatory treatment or punishment. The one thing those who have unleashed terror in the world have used consistently is cruel and inhuman treatment. And one of the things that we see on our TVs and on the internet more frequently than would like to is beheading of people. The fifth rule is the use of regulated warfare. But basically, just having looked at these rules, I hope you'll agree with me, colleagues, that from our side, those of us who are not on the side of terror, for those of us who are supposed to be fighting against terror, it would help if we stayed with the rule of law. And what is the rule of law? No person or institution is above the law, which must be applied fairly, consistently, and ultimately interpreted by independent, competent, accessible courts and related institutions. So from our side, it should be necessary to apply those Geneva Conventions, Hague Conventions, and customary international law. But what we all know is there isn't a declared war. So you apply those conventions if there's a declared war, so there's a defined other side. So if you apply those, you assume that the other side will play by the rules as well. So that's missing. But secondly, some of the weapons that are being used today, like the drones, were not there when these rules were formed. So it was assumed that combatants would be on site from both sides. And therefore, the rules we're dealing with such. So how do we deal with these things? Well, firstly, just on the issue of the rule of law, I would say that we need to revisit the principles of global governance and look at whether or not adaptations can't be made to deal with war situations in the contemporary situation. Why is it necessary to do so? Is that if we are the first in breaking the rules, those of us who claim to be on the side of justice, it's easier for the other side to win support. Yes, I've said many of the children that are being used as human weapons have done so without their consent. But there's children all over the world, in my country included, that are being recruited in their teens, when at least in terms of the law, they now have the ability to consent, and they're joining voluntarily. And the appeal there is a question of social injustice. And part of the appeal when it comes to social injustice is people who have been hurt as collateral damage. These people were going on with their own lives, hurting no one, and they were caught up in this situation, left with nothing. Half of your family or your entire family is decimated. You used to have a profession, your factory, everything is thrown away, and you have nothing more to lose. It is human that you may gravitate towards anything that seeks revenge. So how do we minimize that? By firstly, ensuring that there is accountability in terms of international law where possible, such as unilateralism. We have to make sure that there's accountability for that. But I think for me, above everything else, restorative justice. Those that have been left without homes, there has to be some kind of global scheme, similar to the schemes that responded to the Second World War, to assist them. Yes, some of them are refugees, and we thank countries like Germany, South Africa, and others that have accepted these refugees into their own countries. But some of them don't want to be refugees. They want to stay in their own countries where they can claim all rights, where they can claim their identity in its fullest sense. So there has to be some way of rehabilitating them in their own countries. But how do you rehabilitate people just towards the end of closing, where the domestic situation itself is still a problem? And that takes me back to the idea of rethinking democracy. And one of the speakers this morning beat me to it, UNESCO representatives, who spoke about the difference between what I call here substantive democracy and formal democracy. The rules of democracy, again, were formulated when societies were still small groups, where you really knew where the government is, and anyone could walk there and probably listen to them, and they could be changed. And just finishing. With rules, well, you could visit those people and you could change. You could listen to them and you could challenge them. But today, we really are virtual societies. We communicate with government once every 5 years. Even the thinking that 5 years is the best in terms of changing a government that you don't want was considered right then. Is it still right? If I buy something right now, I'm told that I can send it back in my country in 7 days. No questions asked, buyer's remorse. I can send it back in 7 days. If it's defective, I can send it back within 1 year. If you elect politicians in good faith, and halfway through they don't do what you expected, you have to wait for another 5 years. Was that a good assumption? Or could you take a referendum in between? But basically, just to go back to what was said this morning, I also arrived at the same thing around we need to rethink democracy. We need to reimagine democracy, because it was supposed to be the government of the people, for the people, by the people. So the idea was that people should continuously be involved in electing, but surely not just be left out. And many of our constitutions, mine included, tries to make sure that the dialogue between the elected and the electors continues throughout. But does it always happen? Not always. And what happens if it doesn't happen? Some of the countries, most countries have courts. Some of the countries, like mine, have included another pillar of accountability, which is institutions like ombudsmen, like institution. My institution is the public protector. That, of course, enriches democracy, because it allows people to go through the political accountability channel, the legal accountability channel, or judicial accountability channel, but there's also this administrative pillar. And then obviously having the independent media and others. But still, all of those just foster accountability. They don't deal with a situation where you feel that perhaps you made a mistake. Should we be rethinking democracy and providing for opportunities to reconsider without waiting for 5 years? And all of this is to make sure that people don't need to gravitate towards violence to assert themselves. But secondly, just lastly, around reconsidering democracy and having social justices, at the moment, most of our democracies are either winner takes it all, which is the constituency-based system, or proportional representation, which is what we have. But still, it has to go through political parties. With more minorities in our countries, they might not have any political party. Shouldn't we be rethinking having maybe set asides for certain groups, making sure that people are represented? Because it's all really about making sure that whatever we're doing together improves the quality of life for every person in that society. That everyone is better in the group than outside the group, regardless of their ethnicity, their age, their nationality, or any other human difference. I'm just raising these questions, and with the hope that in the next 2 days we'll think about them. But Einstein, who I understand is originally from this country, said that if you keep doing things the same way and hoping to get different results, that is an act of madness. And I know we're not mad. I know that we've been doing these things the same ways and hoping we can get different results. And I'm excited, therefore, by the conversation we've been having since this morning that is saying we're rethinking everything, because it was people like us who came up with those ideas. And it can be people like us that can come up with these ideas. And the glimmer of hope for me are two things. The UN Sustainable Development Goals understand the link between social justice, rule of law, and peace and stability in the world. Research that is being done by the World Economic Forum is telling us that young people are rethinking these things too. And in particular, young people think that without inclusiveness in the dialogue and without social justice, we can forget about peace and development. Let's make the jump. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very thought-provoking and inspiring keynote address, which is, again, a topic which is vitally important. As you may know also, cultural diplomacy for a long time, human rights and justice has been absent from the conversation. Cultural diplomacy traditionally was about jazz, about design, about the arts. But I think it's really fundamental that we discuss these issues, especially in the framework of building trust and building understanding. So we really appreciate the keynote address. We have time for 2 brief questions, if possible. As always, if you could raise your hand and then briefly introduce yourself when posing the question. So 1, 2, ladies first, and then some responses.
Ms. Madonsela, I'm down here. Claire, I'm the other South African in the room. Yeah, it's an honor to be in the same room as you because I really admire your bravery. This woman is not afraid to expose the government expose Zuma for what he does with our money. And yeah, so I commend you for your bravery and everything that you do. But I would just like to ask I'm also a law student, so I understand the importance of the rule of law. And I also understand that our president doesn't really conform to the rule of law. So how do you see South Africa going forward when those who meant to set the example are setting the example not to conform to the rule of law? So, yeah, that for me is just a very difficult question to answer. But the other one is that what if, as the ANC now wants, what if we withdraw from the ICC? Then where is the accountability that you were speaking of? Because if the president's not afraid to undermine the rule of law, then surely he's not afraid to further that. Yeah, that I'm just going to leave it at that.
And if it's okay, we'll take one more question, and then you'll have a chance to respond to actually those two as well as this, please. And if you could please introduce yourself, please.
I'm Mahmoud Asmati from Afghanistan. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Well, when you talk about peace, social justice, and rule of law, I was thinking about the region that I live there. You correctly mentioned about that no institution is above the law. But you know that sometimes building trust, as Mark mentioned, is very important. I mean, those who are actors, and especially the states, when they're fighting against terrorism, from another hand, people should trust these states or actors who are fighting there. You know that sometimes, due to political affiliation or whatever, they can be sometimes above the law. For instance, in the context of Afghanistan, you know that more or less 40 countries are there fighting terror, and also there are many terrorist groups in Afghanistan from abroad, but still they call Afghanistan's war is a national conflict. Why? It's very clear in IHL that a very clear definition of international conflict. This is one thing that, if you don't mind, just mention how we use this cultural diplomacy at regional level to build trust that people, for instance, Afghanistan, they believe that states who are supporting us, they are not above the law due to their politics or politician. This is something that, and also usage of the weapons during the war, which indiscriminately kills people, as civilians and militaries. So this is another issue. Harry strikes, and then they say, can just make it easy with an apology, like attack in a hospital in Kunduz was an issue. So how we can build trust of people that states are there fighting against terrorists, it's in our own benefit. Otherwise, the number of the people who are fighting against the Afghan government is increasing. Thank you very much.
So, Ms. Madonsela, if you could please respond the best way you can to those big questions in a brief way, because we are actually a little bit over time, and then maybe a few words of conclusion.
Thank you, Mr. Donfield. I appreciate that. Thank you for asking the questions, and Claire, thank you for the kind compliment. Don't believe everything she says, though, except about my institution, of course. You know, Clay, that I can't really answer you about fully about the president, but I can have a private conversation with you. What I would say, though, just generally, is combining perhaps my response to both colleagues that have asked these important questions, is those who make rules have a higher responsibility to comply with the rules if the rules are to be obeyed. And that applies whether we're talking about international law or we're talking domestic law. So president, ministers, MPs, judges, and us have a higher responsibility to comply with the rules. And we not just suppose those who make the rules, it's not enough to comply with the letter of the rules. You have to be seen to be complying with the spirit of the rules. And I think the crisis that you're talking about is there is a perception that there has been no compliance with the spirit, because the understanding is that there is a rule of law. I would say there's a rule of law in that what has happened is when a court of law finally says do it, it gets done. And there isn't open defiance that says we're not going to, for example, we're not going to take what the public protector says. It is, we will differ. If we differ with her, we're not going to apply. But fortunately, the courts now have spoken to say, when my office has made a decision, everyone must comply, unless my decision specifically indicated it's a suggestion. But if it was an order, it must be complied with unless the person takes the matter to court. It still doesn't answer your question, Claire, because, as I said, the rule makers have a higher responsibility to comply. They don't have to wait to be compelled by a court order to do it. Which boils down, colleague from Afghanistan, to your question about trust. People who are employed within the state are employed purely on the basis of trust. Public power, exercise of public power is purely about entrusted power. You would never put a criminal there. You would put somebody you trust because you're not always going to be there, particularly in the complex modern state. You are not going to be there, so you put people who are trustworthy. So what people say and what people do has to inspire trust, has to inspire confidence, rather than create suspicion. Because when people suspect that those in authority do not respect the rules, people start saying then, if you can defend your actions either through your own use of power or whatever means you have, then you can break the rules. And that's where people take to the streets. Lastly, about the complex issue of ICC. Fortunately, it was just a party that said it was considering not withdrawing from the ICC. It's not the government, so it's not a policy. My own paper, which I presented recently at the Institute for International Strategic Studies, was no, we shouldn't withdraw. Clearly, there are problems in the ICC, and I don't want to discuss them right now. But the idea is it was placed there to solve a problem. So by withdrawing, the problem is not going to withdraw. So we must stick with it, try to reform it. If we fail, let's replace it with something. Once a replacement is in place and doing the job, then we can withdraw, but we can't leave a gap. It might not mean anything to you and me immediately, but to a rural woman who may be raped in the midst of conflict, they want to know that there will be some kind of justice. And the one who wants to rape and the one who wants to pillage will at least somehow be deterred if they know that there's a possibility that they may appear before the ICC. So that's what. Just lastly, on building trust, I've already said that I agree with you, and I agree with the stuff that you have made about the importance of building trust, not just through what we say and through actions, which means those in government and those who are monitoring international law, they should try as much as possible to find themselves on the side of the law and on the side of justice. But where people have been harmed, because it may happen, it should never be deliberate. I personally just think humans should not be deliberately considered collateral damage. And that's in line with international humanitarian law. But when it has happened, there has to be some kind of restorative justice. And we shouldn't only be concerned when a hospital with professionals has been attacked. Of course, hospitals should not be attacked. It's part of the international humanitarian laws that I was speaking about. But we should be concerned even if it's an ordinary civilian who is nameless. The people in our country that we call Grandmother Dlamini, they too have a right not to be harmed when they have done nothing. And even those who have harmed people, international humanitarian law says capture them and deal with them in accordance with the law. Again, thank you for this opportunity. Enjoy the rest of the discussions.
Thank you very much. The Honorable Ms. Thuli Madonsela.